Verdun is a small, wonderful, beautiful French town with so much rich history and culture, yet only 22,000 inhabitants. It might have been unknown to the world if it had not been for the events that had forever engraved its name in the annals of history and given it such a very special meaning to the French people, and to us military historians especially. The meaning of Verdun to the French patriotism is incalculable, and its soil is covered by the graves of those who fought and died here in so many conflicts fought here. It was, in 1916, the most heavily bombarded town on Earth, shelled at times by both German and French forces. In just a 4-month stretch of the fighting, 24 million shells landed here. That's more than 2 shells every second of every day. In February 1916, Erich Falkenhayn, in charge of the German army, finally began his assault on Verdun. It lasted for 10 months. Yet tactically, Verdun had little meaning to either side, yet it had to be contested by both sides, but for different reasons. Verdun was fought for bitterly during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when the town's defenders did not surrender until after Paris had fallen. And they defended heroically. Thus, Verdun became an important historic location, symbolizing heroic French resistance. And Falkenhayn, he knew this, and he believed that if he attacked here, he could literally draw in the French army and bleed them dry. He did not want to actually take and occupy the town. He just wanted to kill those who continued to trickle in and defend her once attacked. And for this very reason, Verdun was like many other fortified towns such as Liège or Metz, now surrounded by forts in order to defend the city. These forts had been constructed after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, some earlier, yet all upgraded until the very eve of World War I. Lessons learned, many of them from Feste de Mutzig, and others that have been incorporated in these new designs on both French and German sides. They were all the most modern fortresses with steel domes, huge cannons and howitzers, machine guns, and all mutually defending and supporting. World War I was to become the first modern war. However, so many soldiers were still in uniform similar to those on the parade grounds. You would see horse cavalry attack with lances. You would see tactics both the Napoleons would have recognized. And yet, of all these lessons that should have been learned from the War of 1870, they seemed lost after so many years of peace. The fact that having soldiers or cavalry charge point blank into enemy rifle or automatic fire seemed a very, very bad idea. Well, for some reason, this never dawned on many of the commanders of the First World War. In fact, every country, France, Russia, Germany, had blocking forces at times behind the human waves of attacks to gun down those who might retreat. In the War of 1870, this tactic was not necessary, as in fact, this was the first real modern war of annihilation by modern weapons. And both sides, they knew it. But the commanders seemed too careless or too full of zeal and elan to stop the slaughter then, just like they didn't in World War I. Yet apparently the lonely soldier in the trenches of both these wars, they knew. And we must never forget the courage of all those soldiers who willingly and knowingly stood up, crawled over the parapet, and walked slowly towards their own certain demise, shelled at times by both their own and enemy artillery alike. But one lesson that was understood on all sides was that cities with fortresses constructed around them held out longer against sieges. In 1870, those cities with forward forts held out longer than those without. And as all sides had prepared for World War I to arrive, all sides had begun a frantic fortress construction program, as well as various degrees of rearming, especially Germany and France, as both knew a showdown was inevitable after the War of 1870. The very saddest fact of World War I is that there was an untold number of times when it could have been avoided, but nobody seemed particularly interested in a continued peace. So at the very first spark, set off far, far from France and German borders in Sarajevo, all the dominoes fell, just as they had been lined up to do, just waiting for that small event to nudge over the first one. However, let's go back to the forts. One of the largest, and then claimed to be the best fortified fort in the world, was at Verdun, Fort Douaumont. It was a symbol of French pride and prestige. Douaurmont's construction began in 1885 and lasted until 1913. It cost 6 million gold francs, enough to pay the wages of 300,000 French soldiers for an entire year. So it was a great symbol of French pride, and with good reason. The civilians felt safe and protected. But looking at the forts at this era, it's hard to see what lies beneath, as only the armaments protrude, turrets both rising and fixed. The vast underground cities, with over 500 soldiers posted there, they lie beneath, invisible meters of unreinforced cement and earth. Now, for historians, these forts are amazing to explore, given their diversity of construction. But all was not well. There were problems and flaws in the logic, their designs. These would already show themselves in the initial stages of the war and prove fatal to many defenders. And in 1916, with 850 heavy German guns and howitzers, railguns, along with 75 battalions of soldiers brought up in secrecy just for the first attack wave alone, that would prove a test for the forts of Verdun and the city itself. The Germans attacked on a 19-mile-wide front. After heavy bombardment so thick individual flashes could not be identified, they were preceded by marksmen and troops leading with flamethrowers. Yet the guns at Douaurmont was strangely silent during the initial attack. In fact, the guns of Douaurmont were not there to defend the fort itself, but its neighboring forts, such as the smaller fort at Fort Douaumont, its neighboring fort. These were all mutually supporting lines of forts. An important French figure here was Émile Durand. He was an elected deputy, nearly 60 years old at the war's beginning, and he enlisted as a lieutenant colonel. And he was a bit of a pain in the butt to the French High Command, since he continuously sent reports, including through the government, when he still was a member, that Verdun was weakly defended. The forts had been stripped and his men was not properly protected. His command post was located not far from Douaumont, in a forest a few miles away. And you may now wonder, why was he not commanding from inside this great fort? We'll get to that in a minute.
This is where the battle started, and it featured a character in French history, Colonel Drion. He was the assistant to General Boulanger in North Africa. He'd followed the general back to France, and he'd married the general's daughter, thinking this was a brilliant career move because Boulanger had become the defense minister. Well, the war minister. They didn't have defense ministers. They were going to attack people. So it was the war minister. And Drion was his assistant. So he thought, yes, and his son-in-law. This is great. Then, unfortunately, Boulanger goes and starts a royalist coup against the Republic. Leads his men towards Paris. Halfway towards Paris, he abandons his army and runs off to Brussels to the grave of his mistress, who died several months earlier, pulls out his 1873 pistol and puts a bullet in his head on the grave. So now Boulanger is disgraced, and his son-in-law is really in a bad way. So he is completely ignored for all promotions, except, you know, it takes years and years and years. He finally gets up to being colonel. In between times, he's written the most fantastic books on the future of warfare. He writes alternative history books, which is why I like him, because my first book was an alternate history book of World War II. So immediately I fitted in with Drion's thinking. He got to be deputy for Nancy, and finally, when World War I started, the army sent him here to what they thought was going to be a quiet zone, because they weren't giving him any great responsibility. Now Drion, being quite a smart guy, realized that half the Imperial German army was just the other side of the forest. So he himself personally arranged 3 lines of defense for his own men, with concrete bunkers, a concrete first aid post and a concrete headquarters, so that if the Germans did attack, at least his men would have some chance. Now at 7:15 on the morning of the 21st of February 1916, Drion was here with his 1,200 chasseurs, the light infantry. He'd ridden up from Verdun, and he'd given his wedding ring to his assistant to keep for him, because he had a foreboding that something was in the wind. At 7:15, the chasseurs were grinding their coffee, they were lighting their pipes, when the 900 guns that the Crown Prince had pointed at this wood as a weak sector opened fire. And the strange thing is that it wasn't the noise of the explosions. Everything seemed to these men to happen in silence. The whole forest flew up in the air. And several seconds later, the whole forest flew up in the air again, came crashing down. And that kept on going for a day and a half. And the Germans launched their attack with flamethrowers, light machine guns, etc. And that continued for a day and a half. The Crown Prince has said, you know, it'd take a few hours to get through this forest. And the French held them off for this day and a half. A day and a half they fought back. They crawled out of their foxholes, they set up their machine guns, and they fought off the advancing Germans. Much to the Germans expected everybody to be flattened, and they weren't. There were survivors who fought back. The French lost their first line, they pulled back to the second line, they pulled back to the third line, and Drion was in his command bunker when the Germans had brought a field gun through the woods to point it in the rear entrance of the bunker. Someone pointed this out to him and said, "Chief, we better leave." So finally, reluctantly, he gave the order not to retreat, but to withdraw to the next defensive position. And as he was pushing his men like a shepherd with his colonel's cane, he was pushing them ahead of him, he was following up behind them, he stopped to help a wounded chasseur, and a German machine gun bullet hit him and killed him. And he's buried some distance away with 13 of his men around him. So a sad end to poor Drion, who would have had a great future. He's the kind of guy the French army needed, a guy with intelligence and who looked after his own men.
These are all the shell holes.
Shell holes
from
where
World
the
War
forest
I.
used to be. Yeah.
From 1916.
Yeah. The whole forest is pockmarked, and the trees have grown up again since. But the whole place was flattened. All the trees were blown in the air. And they survived. That's what gets me. They dived into foxholes. 1,200 men. I mean, he got out with there were about, was it 400 or 500 got away to French lines. And the rest were either killed or wounded or captured. But you see, their resistance for that day and a half helped the French to rush reinforcements into Verdun.
And that's why Verdun held.
Yeah. Because of, I don't know, it's on the show.
Because everybody expected Verdun to fall.
Well, yeah.
And several of the French generals were all in favor of abandoning Verdun.
Yes. Well, I hate to say it, but I would have done as well. The major problem for the Germans was that the Crown Prince was told by the High Command to attack Verdun. He thought his job was to capture Verdun. That wasn't the issue. The issue was to draw the whole French army into the trap with these 1,500 cannons in a semicircle to the north and northeast of the town, and destroy them by shell fire, the Trommelfeuer, that they used so well in Russia. Now, the Crown Prince wasn't told this. So every time he was just about to break through, he would ask for another 1,000 men or another 50 cannons, and the High Command said, no, 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 you have to make do with what you've got. They chose him as a scapegoat, if you like.
So
To destroy the French army, and if it failed, it was going to be his fault. And they never gave him enough men and for the final push. Because the tragedy is, if the poor guy had broken into Verdun, his men would have been trapped in the town centre, surrounded by the rest of the forts that had never fallen, that would have turned their turrets inboard and bombarded the ruins. It would have been Stalingrad on the Meuse.
Frederick the Great, his father hated him. He didn't trust him. He didn't like him. He criticized him. It's horrible. He didn't understand this, that, and the other. And then, of course, he became the Great for a reason. I guess having a horrible militant upbringing is not always a bad thing.
That's true, yeah. This is the command bunker. There are other bunkers throughout the woods. There were 3 lines of concrete bunkers to protect his troops. And as I say, a concrete first aid post we'll see in a while now. But Douaumont, the enemy's coming from that direction. And Douaumont fought them off. A big shell hit the end of the bunker, and the roof was pushed downwards, but not penetrated. Now his men built these themselves. The French army didn't want anything to do with it. Like the Crown Prince, when Douaumont said, I need artillery. No, no, you'll never need it. It's a quiet zone. I need more machine guns. No, 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 you know, we're giving those to the hot sectors. So he realized he had to do something to protect his men. He got these bunkers built. He brought in contractors, his men helped. They brought the concrete and they protected themselves, which is amazing. Can you imagine another general doing that for his men?
This was literally Battle of the Bastards.
Yeah, yeah.
The German nobody wanted, the French nobody wanted.
Exactly. Now, the trouble is, they're fighting the advancing Germans coming from that direction, but when the Germans dragged, one of his men said, look, they're bringing up a 77 behind us, and all the openings, it's a death trap. One shell inside would have killed everybody.
Yeah.
At that point, Douaumont says, okay, guys, time to go. And these are all the emblems of the chasseurs regiments. Monument to the chasseurs.
Well, it is now.
Yeah.
Now he's good enough.
Now.
Now that he's dead and he's not going to do like his dad and try to overthrow the crown, we're okay with him.
Yeah, that's what the shell hit. The big shell must have been it's not a 42. That would have gone through. It's not reinforced concrete. That must have been a 17 centimeter or a 19 centimeter, which hit the roof there and caved it down. As we see, it's quite impressive. They must have had a bad headache from that. But he built this himself. What a guy! What a great guy!
You know, there's a lot of bunkers in my life I've seen. I have rarely wanted to see anyone inside as much as I do want to see this. And this is actually very nicely built. This is actually... the rock is carved. It's...
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I see with the roof. I see the dent here, yeah.
Yes, that's a big dent. And they've concreted it up to support it. But that must have been exciting to be in here when that happened. And the floor got...
That's some work for it.
Tanked as well.
Oh, it almost.
It almost got through. Almost.
And it lifted the floor as well.
Yes, yes it did. So this was his HQ, and oh look, there must have been a partition there. Perhaps that was their storeroom.
Well, that would make sense. Then,
yeah.
And the shockwave wouldn't have traveled.
No, the rest of it is completely undamaged. Well, the floor has risen here, but that's tree roots pushing it up. Don't forget, it was built in a hurry. You can see, it's just concrete shoved in as fast as they could go, because he knew something was coming. He sent his scouts out. He wasn't stupid. They'd observed what the Germans were up to.
So these are actually firing embrasures?
Yes, yeah. They might have had armor over them, I don't know.
But he built them predominantly for protection. How many people were in here, do we know?
The headquarters staff of 2 half regiments of chasseurs, there might have been about 20 men in here, I suppose. But they'd have brought machine guns in with them to defend the place. Yeah, it's very nifty,
it really
isn't
is. It really is. You really see how, and it's amazing because you can, on one hand, yes, it's thrown together, but on the other hand, it's still here. 107.
105 years.
105 years.
And it survived a hell of a big hit that would have taken out a lot of other bunkers. As I say, once they brought a field gun up behind, this was untenable.
Yeah, because that was a howitzer hit.
Yeah.
If direct fire, that's a whole different ballgame. Especially when it's not non-reinforced, there's no rebar, no steel in the walls. That changes things.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if these are these like you would use in a bridge? There must be rebar inside them.
Well,
I mean, that would never have survived if it didn't have reinforcement rods in it.
Well, that's the interesting thing. Initially I thought they were cast marks. Where you put the wood planks and then you cast them. But if it was, you wouldn't cast them with separation. So these must have been made somewhere else
they're
and put here.
Materials, yeah. Aren't they?
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute, there's a hole that can be seen. There's no rebar showing through them. They're just concrete flooring blocks from buildings.
Yeah, and the concrete was poured on some sort of wooden scaffolding, wooden sections, and then. Yeah, there's
no rebar in them.
No, there's not.
This one it's chewed away here by frost and all.
So what he probably did, he did put these, and then on top of these he put rocks on laid over these.
Yes. Yeah. Well, a great guy.
I
mean, the walls aren't even straight here. What the hell, just build it, mate.
I know. I mean.
So he's one of my great heroes against Rion.
Yeah.
A sad fate. He deserved better.
I wonder if that is the cross beams, or they're in under the wall, and then this is just layered on top.
Oh, is that rebar there above that window? Yes, it is.
It is. Yeah, that is a piece of steel. But that could also just have been used to reinforce the windowsill.
Yeah, that's true. But that's quite a substantial thickness of roof.
Wait a minute. No, what is this? No, this is just a.
But look at the thickness of the roof. It's amazing. Isn't it?
It is.
All right, there's earth on top, I know, but most of that up to about there is concrete.
Not much.
No?
It's only like a little bit here. This is still solid.
Yeah, that's the concrete.
This is still solid. Yeah. The rebar there.
Yeah.
But I think that's also just some of the sections. Maybe even inside there's one strand of metal, which is
not very much, is there?
No. But it wasn't really until. I mean, this is what he would have known, because before World War I, the new thing was using cement to reinforce all the old Prussian Franco war.
The special cement using the Roman formula used at Douaurmont, another fort.
And they were expecting the Germans to come from the left here.
Yeah.
So that's why they build up dirt on this side.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they must have been for vision and firing. Such a beautiful place. This really is something special. And you have the whole trench system behind them.
Yeah.
Did they start building bunkers, fortified bunkers, before the fighting started, or?
Well, when the Germans moved in, they captured the high ground, and therefore they built their deep bunkers there, expecting the French to attack, while they dealt with the Russian steamroller in the east. But the French here were building abris back years before World War One.
And then when the Germans started their surrounding of Verdun, they started building pillboxes around it.
Boxes all around, yeah.
It's amazing how quickly you can really build something like this when you really, really have to. And today you can't get permits to extend your summer house garage for 6 years.
Oh, I know. Well, he really cared about his men. He knew that the key to success was, you know, you boost your men's morale by protecting them, and then they will fight for you. They'll do anything for you then.
And you know what? It's sad that he was a special guy because he cared about his men, because that says something about the officers of the time, where the men were just expendable. We'll just send in another 1,000 and another 1,000. It's fine. They're just. Well, how many times in the annals of World War I history have we not heard the terms? They're just men.
Yeah. Haig discussing it with the British Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, said, "Well, how are we doing?" And Haig said, "Well, we're killing as many Germans as they're killing, and there are more of us. And so if we keep on like this, the Germans will be exterminated." And Lord George said, "Yeah, but we won't have very many men left." "Oh, no, that's nothing to do with it. We'll have won." That was what he said to the Prime Minister. Look, I think that's a shell hit in the middle of the trench.
It does look like that.
Yeah. Right in the corner. Because communication trenches were not very deep, the communication. Of course, they've been filled with earth and...
But it's still, after 100 years, they're still here. It's just... It's still impressive to see that... Oh, that's a deep hole.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
That may be a 42 centimeter, I don't know. But there must be hundreds here. Thousands.
I mean, it's really, really hard to transmit onto a camera just exactly how it looks when you walk across a field that looks like a cheese. And not a young cheese either, an old one.
This is another construction by Colonel Le Drian to protect his men. Behind the fighting lines, he arranged a concreted, protected first aid post where the wounded could be treated. And that's unheard of at the time, you know. He was really forward-looking with that. The entrance has taken a big shell as well, a shell hit. And it still survived. They still pulled the men out of it.
I see rebar. Yes. So it caved. This was pretty much just it.
Well, there was a roof over this.
There was a roof over it, yeah.
Over the entrance that the shell hit.
So is there an inside into...
Yeah, there's an inside. Yeah.
So that's where it would go in the... Oh,
that's
yeah.
The first aid post inside there.
Oh, yes. I see the... No, I don't. I see branches and rock that's come in. I thought I was looking at the corrugated steel roof that he might have used.
This might have been the entire first aid post then.
Well, on the other side of this wall, I seem to remember being a whole lot of holes. Yeah. So that very likely could have caved in after the fact.
Yes.
But at least there's rebar.
Yeah,
and
very thick rebar, big rebar here as well.
And bricks.
Yep. And the men inside survived the shell hit.
I'm thinking on this wall, here was the roof that would lay on this brick top, probably.
Yes.
And yeah, there's some good stone and...
Yeah, sad tale, a sad end to a great guy.
Yeah.
Well, we've all got to go, and at least he's now a legend.
Opposing him on the German side was the Kaiser Wilhelm's son, Wilhelm. He was dubbed Little Willie. He was 33 years old and he commanded the 5th Army and had done so since 1914, and he had done quite well, and he had good instincts. Now he understood the flaws in Falkenhayn's plan of attacking Verdun but not actually trying to take the city. He understood the psychology of asking soldiers to attack ground but not seize it or hold it. It was morally impossible to explain, and outright demoralizing to do so. So he charged with the intent of capturing ground and even Verdun if he could. The conflicting chain of command and objectives would eventually conflict the German command down the line. On the French side, another name we will hear more of in World War II was Philippe Pétain. At the time, he was 59 years old and eventually became the overall commander of the defense of Verdun. He had also been a bit of a firebrand, sending many reports of the importance of artillery and firepower, short of just charging the enemy full of elan. And he understood artillery and logistics would become crucial for the defense of the town. However, it had already failed the existing forts. Falkenhayn's plan was to capture Douaurmont as the linchpin of his attack, one in which he wanted to draw in the French army, and to do this at 1,300 meters above sea level. Douaurmont was the high ground that could threaten Verdun, drawing in the French army to his kill zone. But he also knew how dangerous and armed the fort was, so it was a daunting task, he thought. At the time of the battle, Fortress Douaumont only had 58 older soldiers defending it. It had nearly been stripped of all its guns, and those remaining was not even manned. So when Sergeant Kunz of the 24th Brandenburger crept up to the fort with his 9 men, he was baffled that nobody had fired upon them. So he continued.
Because the French had built the most powerful fort, Manovier, 11 kilometers from the new frontier. It's far to the east, beyond Nancy. And it fell to the Germans. They surrounded it. They bluffed their way in by saying, look, listen, you can't do any fighting. That's because the war has ended. And they sent away their last messenger pigeons and none came back. So the officer in command, well, he took the easier way out. Either his men were going to die under bombardment or they were going to be taken prisoner and survive.
1916.
1914, the very first week of the war. The Germans surrounded it and bombarded it with their big howitzers, the 42 centimeter and the 30.5 centimeter Austro-Hungarian ones built by Skoda. And there was a lot of gas got inside and debris, but the fort was still in fighting condition. But because the commander thought he was surrounded, the French army had withdrawn kilometers from their position, he saw no reason to just simply go on to the last cartridge and the last man and they'd all die. So he gave up. A week later, the French army counterattacked and retook the fort. But before the Germans left, they blew up the entire fort. You have corridors of solid concrete, not reinforced, that are about 1.5 meters thick, which have been moved sideways about 1 meter by internal explosions. You've got gigantic 160-ton twin 155 gun turrets that have been blown in the air and land in pieces in the ditch. And when the French saw this, they thought, my God, our best fort, our strongest, the best defended, with the most turrets in the whole, virtually, of Europe, has been completely destroyed by the German howitzers. They didn't realize it was demolition charges. When you're in any close space, the force is multiplied many times and had blown these turrets right in the air. The shells falling from the outside hadn't done anything except scratch the paint of these turrets, gigantic monsters. So the French thought these forts were death traps, like back in the 1880s when the new shells, the torpedo shells came in. And they said, what are we going to do? We need the men, we need the guns, the 75mm guns, we need the shells. We need the machine guns that defend these places. So they took them all out of the fort and they put them in the trenches. And then, just before the German attack, they laid explosive demolition charges themselves inside to blow up the forts in case the Germans came. And when the Germans made their surprise attack here, well, it was a surprise to everybody except Drion, one of the first victims. He knew it was coming, but nobody believed him. That's another story. When the Germans came here, there was a tiny team left inside the fort, and their job was to fire the last shells out of the gun turret up there on the roof, and then blow the whole thing up. They'd put 50 tons of dynamite in strategic positions to destroy it. And then the Germans attacked. And The legend, and I like to believe legends, is that an engineer, Sergeant Kuntz, Feldwebel Kuntz, armed with a Luger pistol, jumped down into the ditch surrounding the fort. Now, normally that's a killing ground.
Yes.
When you're in there, you've got 5-barreled 40mm cannons that will rake the whole ditch. You don't last more than a second or two. So he's looking around, and some of his men jump down to follow him nervously. And he goes to one of these gun embrasures at the end of the ditch and looks in, there's no cannon. It's in the Bois des Corps with Drion. I know, because I've seen the German postcard. Ooh, look what we found here. So he climbs in. The engineers, they either make holes or they find holes and they go in. Followed by some of his men. He follows the sound of a cannon firing through the corridors. There are kilometers of corridors in this thing. Comes into the main chamber underneath the turret. Walks in, finds 15 reservists who've left their rifles in the next to their bunks, and says, "Hands up, hand hoch." He's captured the Fort Douaumont, single-handed, one of the largest forts around here.
Now the great French fort had fallen without a single shot fired. The French was in uproar, and the Kaiser gave the schools a day off in celebration. Yet not a shot had been fired. Tactically, this was not really a solid gain for the Germans, as they had not taken the forts on the other side of the river Meuse. They were now vulnerable to flanking fire, something the French would very soon embark upon with ferocity, and they would shell Douaurmont themselves. So before you all begin to pull out your hair, let me explain why the French had evacuated this and so many other forts by 1916 of its armament, or at least the reasoning at the time. You see, one of the problems with the evolution of modern forts was that we in a relatively short time, historically speaking, had moved from earth mounds and stones to cement and bricks. However, the Douaumont forts and those of that era was indeed built with cement, but they were unreinforced, and therein lies the main lesson remaining to be learned. And in 1914, this became painfully clear in Belgium, as the Germans attacked the Belgian forts designed by Douaumont there. Nowhere was this more evident than at Fort Douaumont, one of the forts surrounding the city of Liège. General Gerard Lemont had moved his command post into Fort Douaumont, it being the strongest and best armed fort in Belgium. The massif was 4 meters thick, built to withstand the heaviest 210 centimeter of shells. However, when the Germans rolled up a 420 centimeter howitzer and shelled the fort for days, at the time, one 420 centimeter shell hit, the fort erupted like a volcano, killing nearly everybody inside. The blast wave traveled through the hallways, collapsing much of the fort, blowing the enormous steel turrets up in the air, spinning them midair. And the German shell had hit the magazine and set off 12 tons of black powder. This fort was the only one that never surrendered, as there was no one left alive capable of doing so. Most of the dead still occupy their posts in this fort today. So it was due to this very lesson the French realized that their large forts, all unreinforced, were too vulnerable, and they pulled their soldiers out into the open fields and dug trenches. And this is where they were when the Germans attacked. This information, of course, they had not shared with the French civilians, thus the expected loss of the prestige and present danger to Verdun made it of the highest priority to hold the city and retake Douaumont itself one day.
A lot of us have seen this monument and these structures in passing. You see photos from a battlefield or cemetery, and it doesn't mean anything to you. But when you're standing here and you start hearing the personal stories of how this came about, it starts resonating. And it's interesting being here at Verdun where everything was a battle. Everything was around here was exploding and on fire. And I know there's some helicopters around here, but I keep hearing the thunder from something that sounds like shell fire. And I know the D-Day memorial is going on here, but I keep hearing this thunder once in a while. Sounds like the crack of shell fire. It's eerie. You guys heard that. I don't know if there's an artillery range or military training. There's some helicopters, something going on here. Notice that there's a lot of uneven ground around this fort. I don't know.
Yeah, well, with 60 million shells fired, they've worked out that given the area of the battlefield, that means 4 shells every square meter, on average. I mean, some meters got more and more shells, but 60 million shells over 10 months.
It's impossible to imagine.
Well, your trench dug in the earth covered with tree trunks is not going to last. In 1914 they tried to cut Verdun off from the rest of France by attacking the line of forts which run between here and Toul. They tried to cut through them. They smashed the fort of the Fort Douaumont, which defended, it was on a hill overlooking and defending Saint-Mihiel. And the Germans got in. It was a masonry fort covered with earth. It didn't resist very long. And so they blocked the rail line from Verdun to Nancy for the whole war until the Americans turned up and liberated the Saint-Mihiel salient.
The rail line,
for their practice.
They learned that the rail line was something they learned from the 1870s.
Yes.
That rail connection was important.
Yes, well, the Germans built their rail system for military mobilization.
And the French did that after the...
well, the French connected all their cities and towns together, but not for military purposes. They just benefited from that. The Germans did it expressly for military purposes.
The white stones were the original.
Yeah, and it's nice masonry inside the fort. It's, nice corners and things.
Yeah.
Not as nice as the Germans.
So the shell is what they added onto it.
The tunnel was in masonry originally. Can you see the broken masonry? And then you see they added, there's a space where there would have been the sand.
Yes.
They put the sand over there and then the concrete tunnel over the top of it.
So this was just a much smaller tunnel in 1890. And then they cleaned up the dirt and added on the sand and added on that extra was a meter and a half of cement. So that's interesting. Now you really see how they upgraded it between the wars.
As you approach the fort, this bit's been taken away. I have no idea why. Then you suddenly get to the concrete part, and there is the famous red line, only visible on the left. Everywhere else, the damp in the fort has destroyed it. This means that at this point, for the rest of this tunnel, which went on into the underground part of the fort, here you are safe from any big shells.
That red line.
Yeah.
So that red line is the marker that from here you're safe.
Yeah.
From shells from the outside. And this tunnel went all the way into the fort.
All the way into the fort. You can see the where it goes in here, behind this lift for the disabled. Pre-rusted, which is disappointing. There the tunnel carries on inside the fort.
Oh yes.
There's a big pipe they've stuck there for some reason. But that red line is very important. Thank you. You're also protected because the concrete is above this part as well. But it looked like the masonry ended there. Which I don't know what they did. It's so difficult to tell.
I think this
It's
is
like
just this looks like it's just a cover-up. I say.
Oh yeah, that just covers the.
Yeah, it just makes it. This is just the nicety.
It's porous. Yeah. Well, let's put it this way: the fort was covered in a lead sheeting to make it waterproof. Where the Germans have demolished it, you see the stonework and the sand and the lead and the concrete. The sandwich of all that in one spot is amazing. The lead was fractured by the thousands of shells, and rainwater's got in. So when you're inside the fort, there are places where there are giant stalactites coming down.
There's a very large hole up here behind you.
Now the large hole. The Germans are inside, and they're using it as a shelter, a troop shelter, because the French have fired off virtually all the cannon shells and taken the rest out of the fort. So the gun turret up top is virtually useless. They can't turn it towards the French. The French, on the other hand, they fire thousands of shells at the back. This is the back of the fort. All this destruction has been created virtually by French shells. They bring up a 400 millimeter rail gun.
The French does?
Yeah. Firing a shell weighing over a ton. And that's what makes the hole in the roof there. When the concrete has already been damaged and some of it's been planed away by previous explosions, it's not so resistant. This 1 ton shell falls from the stratosphere and makes that big hole there. It kills about 30 Germans in one of the bedrooms. They're blown to pieces. They're atomized. You know,
yeah.
A 1 ton shell falls in the bedroom and then there's nothing left. The traditional type of French fort was built of masonry covered with earth.
And this after the
Franco-Prussian War, because there was no protection for the frontier at all. The former French forts were now all in the hands of the Germans. And the French never imagined that the Germans would dismantle their 42 centimeter howitzers into 2 or 3 parts and drag them across country. The Belgians didn't think of that, and the French didn't think of that, but then suddenly, after they'd done experiments on one of their brand new forts and had wrecked it, they tested it themselves and they smashed the fort to pieces.
They fired one of the new type of shells at
new
their
type
own
of
forts.
Shells, yeah, and wrecked it. The shells came straight in through the roof. Anyone inside would have been killed. Any ammunition would have exploded, like Fort Douaumont near Liège, where a lot of the garrison blew up when the magazine exploded. They're still buried under the rubble.
So they had to start thinking real quick, and evolution of forts began.
Yes, to reinforce against the modern shells. And so they laid down a carapace, a thick layer of their special concrete, which they'd copied from the Romans. They tested it in the laboratories. It's the béton spécial of the French army. They laid down a layer of sand as to absorb the shock of heavy shells landing, and then they molded in solid blocks the special concrete containing volcanic ash, in the same way as the Romans had made their strongest concrete 2,000 years earlier, which as it ages it actually gets stronger, which is brilliant. But they cast it in homogeneous blocks rather than the separate layers laid down in the Belgian fort. A big German shell went through that like a hot knife through butter, but not here. But the French still did not know, because when the Germans brought their big 42 centimeter howitzers and destroyed the forts at Liège, Namur, Antwerp, Maubeuge, they bombarded Manorville, and the French saw the results of the demolition there. The French had never had the chance to test one of these reinforced forts against the 42 centimeter howitzers, and that's why they panicked. They saw so many forts destroyed, and they thought these are now again death traps for our men.
And that's why they moved all their men outside.
They moved the men outside, and they took out the 75 millimeter guns, and they took out all the ammunition, etc., and all the supplies to use in the field army in the trenches. And at that moment, the Germans attack.
Of course.
A Galopin turret, which contains a single 155 millimeter cannon. It weighs about 70 tons. When this is down, that roof is invulnerable.
Yes.
If the Bismarck had managed to sail up the Meuse, which she couldn't do, and she fired her 15-inch shells at this, 16 inches of armor resists 15-inch shells. They would bounce off like peas. Shells and bombs bounce off these things.
That's 1905.
Yeah, that's the modern 1905. It's controlled. The fire is controlled by the officer with his binoculars there. He's got special binoculars with range marks on it.
Yeah, this has been a lot of hits on this.
Now this would be from Americans trying charges in 1944. They experimented on some of the forts around here because they knew they were going to have to break through the Siegfried line. So they came and blew up some of the French forts.
No matter where I go, whenever the Americans showed up and liberated something,
they blow something,
keep blowing it up.
Yes. The only guns that can fire towards the enemy are in retracting turrets, because they're the only ones that will survive an attack by shells.
Yeah.
The infantry attacking will not get up. They won't directly approach these forts. They'll be taken out by the 40 shells a minute from the close-in defense 75 turret and the machine gun turrets, the twin machine gun turrets, putting out 800 rounds each a minute. So they will tend to filter between the forts and the ouvrage to try to get round behind them.
Of course.
And what happens then is that these forts have a casemate with two 75mm quick-firing guns, the Soissons-quinze, protected by a gigantic concrete wall facing the enemy, and they fire to the side. They fire towards the neighbouring fort or ouvrage, and each one does the same thing. So you're firing from the side to the side to the side, not to the front, with these quick-firing guns.
Yeah.
To take out anybody trying to break through the line of forts. Now, if we were German assault troops who'd managed to fight our way onto the roof, this turret would stay well down. You don't want them shoving explosive charges in the barrel. And the machine gun turret would come up, the twin Hotchkisses would come out and fire 800 rounds a minute continuously. They had articulated
So
belts.
that's a close defensive weapon.
That's a roof defense weapon. And well, you could defend, I mean...
That's the kind of thing Ibn Amal should have had at least one of.
At each, or most of the angles of the ditch, there were firing embrasures, which were joined to the main part of the fort by underground tunnels, firing either old smoothbore guns, the 12-pounders with shrapnel, or the Hotchkiss rotary cannons, the 5-barreled 40mm. You've got to go back to the original documents. And someone found that they'd experimented with the best rifling pitch of their 40mm to defend a ditch all around these forts. And the first rifling pitch made the shell explode there, the second made it explode there, the third made it explode there, and the fourth and the fifth. And they said, hang on a minute, if we have all 5 rifling pitches in one gun, then a couple of turns of the handle, you cover the whole ditch.
All these holes, this used to be a straight wall.
Yeah, there was a wall about this high,
Yeah.
a stone wall on either
This
side.
has been completely pulverized.
Blown away, yeah.
That used to be flush with the top of the fort.
With the turret that we were on.
This is not a pillbox. This was built sunk into the ground,
Yeah.
and the ground was up there
Yeah, connected with the tunnel to the main part of the fort.
and dug in with 42-centimeter holes like that one.
Well, you see, where there are no tunnels, there's just earth. So the shells make big holes.
This is not a fine cement or anything. This is
No, this is post First World War. It may have been a repair. Could have been the American Army built this. We don't know. A sabotage attempt in 1940. They said they pushed a live shell back to front in the 555 turret.
because that's it.
Yeah, someone has sabotaged that.
But it is wartime something. It's not a.
Yeah,
it's-
that'd be 1940 when the Germans came again. This is cupola number 54.
Yep.
And when they're assembling it, the roof goes over the embrasure. And underneath this lead are the bolts that screw it down, screw it together.
It does look like it's sitting a little off kilter.
This one.
The gap here is a little bigger than the gap here.
Yeah. Well, the main turret, they jammed it in the well in 1940 to make sure the Germans couldn't make it go up and down anymore.
This is simply just facing the enemy, and you can't see anything to the sides. But it is post World War I.
Yes, this is post World War I. There wouldn't have been as city as this. The pillbox lines which crossed England, of course, were death traps.
Yeah.
They all had embrasures facing the German tanks. They all stood out in the middle of a field. There was no means of, once the battle had started, you couldn't get in or out of them. You couldn't re-ammunition them or anything. They were death traps.
And you had a straight open hole facing the enemy.
Exactly!
Were these underground or just wells?
They go down to the lower level that we will visit in a few minutes, and the idea is that's where the munitions are kept. So if there's a fire breaks out there, you come up here like a bat out of hell.
Especially if the munitions explode, they will then, yeah.
Well, yeah, if there's a fire, yeah.
Anyway. Escape tunnel. So this is the upstairs of the escape tunnel.
Yeah. And they blocked it to stop silly people trying to climb down it. They built it all in about 3 years, which is staggering when you think it's one of 70 they were building at the time. And it's quite nicely finished stonework for something that was done in such a hurry. Emergency.
It's beautiful stonework.
Yeah. Well, it's not quite up to the standards of the German forts around Metz.
There's no rebar in here.
No. And the standard beds, you find these in all the forts. 2 men up, 2 men down. They slept on straw mattresses, nothing modern, springy or anything like that. With all their household pets, of course, the fleas, the lice, the mice, the rats, everything, keeping them warm at night. They slept in their uniforms because, of course, at any moment the foot could be attacked and you'd have to leap out of bed. The rifles off the rats in between, the rifle rats. These openings at the top, with these funny...
Yes, is that ventilation?
Ventilation entries.
And you had for the heater.
There was
bunker oven.
A stovepipe went up there onto the roof.
Yeah. Is this a later add-on, or what was this?
What you'd have had here, this is probably an annex to store their equipment, I don't know. Right, the wall would have gone over there, and you'd have had large windows with steel shutters that you could shut.
Yes.
Like Venetian blinds.
Yes.
To stop against shell fragments coming in.
Yeah, like you see in the standard forts, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this seems weird.
The barracks blocks are only on one level. And some of the older forts, the non-reinforced peacetime barracks are on 2 levels with nice pink stonework let into them. And then when they were being more hardened, they would rush underground and, completely because the place had been shut from us, the birds would take it over. So can I? Here. Now here's the little light, a military light railway, but this would not get into the fort, they just put this here to show people.
And you really do see the 1800s masonry and the stones.
Yeah, well, this was Napoleonic and before. This goes back to Vauban, this kind of construction.
Napoleon III.
Yeah.
I guess we've got to qualify since there's a few of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, you see it's just like Clapperville and a lot of similar masonry.
Yes, it is. But the German ones, they took much more care to finish off the masonry. It was much more fancy inside, and it didn't need to be. In the Fort Douaumont, we cannot go down in the parts of the underground layer because they're a bat sanctuary.
Just amazing to you look at, you can see the symmetry, you can see the structure, you can see the buildings, how it looked, and then you look at it outside today from above, and you're looking at something that you can barely even distinguish the buildings. See, this is actually, I like these maps in museums, because you have, instead of a digital, you have a physical representation, and I like that because it gives you a much better depth of field and perspective.
Germans held the fort from just after the start of the battle up until the last few weeks of the Battle of Verdun. And when finally the French army was retaking all their own positions and pushing the Germans back to the start line of February, so it ended up as a drawn match, if you like, a drawn contest. Not 0-0, but 150,000 against 150,000, the dead, poor guys. They were abandoning the fort, and a French engineer, corporal, led a few of his men inside through a hole in the wall, came to the command post, went in, les mains en l'air, and he's recaptured the fort without firing a shot. Now between those two moments, those two dramatic moments, 10,000 guys get killed attacking and defending it for nothing at the end, as it turns out. So again, the tragedies of war. Now this is one of the turret 75s. It's a lot shorter than the field gun version. Same caliber, same system of operation, but it's shorter to fit inside the very small diameter of the 1905 turret. There are two of them, and of course they've got beefed up recuperation cylinders, recoil cylinders.
Yeah. This was an engine room. Was there must have been some
generator room, I think.
Yeah, because you have pipes for smoke.
Yes.
You have electrical on the walls. Yeah. You have electrical climbing up over the ceiling.
I think the Germans were the first to install the generator set. The French just had oil lamps.
It was very normal for the French or even Belgians to build the fort, and when the Germans took it, they would upgrade it, and the Belgians and French would take it back.
The Germans did a propaganda, offensive, to say, yes, we've captured the fort of Douaurmont, the most important, the largest of the forts. They called it the most powerful. In fact, in firepower it wasn't, but it was the largest, one of the largest by size, and it dominated the whole battlefield, both the Verdun side and the German side, because it was so high up, 380 meters high. It was higher than all the other forts. So this was linchpin, I think, of the defences, the Fort Douaumont. And when the Germans captured it, they were cock-a-hoop. They announced it in the press, the radio broadcasts, etc. Douaumont ist gefallen. That went out, and the French were so annoyed by that. Now we're heading for the big 155 turret, the Galopin. She's a beauty. The monster I call. I was having the inside one when it's been going up and down. A bit underneath it. The latrine, Turkish toilets.
Oh yes.
Now, all our students, the young students, think that these are shower head holders, but they're not. They were originally down horizontal. They just bent them up in the air so the tourists don't bump their heads against them. These are the tops of the wooden partitions, a little bit of privacy, the privy as we call it in English, between each of the toilets. I don't know whether there was a door in front.
In the Maginot Line World War II, there was only small doors, so you could look in and make sure the guys were not committing suicide. So you would think the World War I, there possibly was a door, because they hadn't really adopted that lesson yet.
Yes. When I visited a fort near Copenhagen, the westward defense line, the guides told us that they completed the fort just before 1914, and they had invited a German officer to look around, because of course the best way to make sure that nobody ever attacks your fort is to say, no, come and look how strongly we built it, these cannons, the armor plating, you've got no chance. The German looked around, he said, well, very impressive, but we would take this fort in less than a day. The Dane said, come on, you must be joking. How can you claim that? He said, it's very simple. You put your toilets all along the outside of the fort, and that would be the first thing I would blow up. And after a couple of days, well, it won't take 1 day, 2 or 3 days, they'd give up, because their toilets were destroyed.
And the funny thing is, the Belgians did that same thing where they put the toilets in, I think it was Pointis. There was built with the toilets on the outside in the camel's cars, which means you have to cross into the moat under fire in order to go take it out. And then the Germans took it in well, they took it fairly early on, and the first thing they did was improve the toilets. So when the buildings got it back, it had proper plumbing. And the Germans reinforced it with rebar as well.
This is the... Oh yeah, that's the platform the officer commanding the turret would stand on as it was lifted up into position. And if he was wounded, then his men could bring the little platform down. And this is what's left of one of the manual ventilators.
So this is the ventilation pipe. I'm guessing for the area for the turret. Well, no, it's not. This goes down. Okay, so that's not it.
And this is a sortie port to get out and man the ramparts. So there would be armored gates, armored doors there.
So we're almost under the large turret.
It's just around the corner.
And there's an exit right here.
Yes.
You would think, oh, okay, all right.
Yeah.
I guess somebody thought they had an idea. I'm not in favor of that idea. Okay, so this pipe is going down, so that must be, or have been a ventilation for down.
Down where the magazines are. Where they get together to talk about the men that they're chasing. Right, here she is, the beast. And she was sabotaged in 1940. The turret was jammed in the well. I don't know how they did it. Brute force. And a live shell was rammed up the barrel. So when the Germans came here, they actually, they thought, uh-oh, and they left it well alone. The problem, I mean, if you're going to sabotage this fort, you do one thing first, before you blow this up. You burn all the firing tables and charts and the maps you've made of the local area. Because the gunnery officers paced out every likely target. The church tower, the road junction, and inside the turret they painted a panorama of the surrounding countryside.
So did they do that?
Yep, they did it, and the officer in the cloche up above, at the top of that little wooden platform that we saw in the well, he would speak to the gunners. He would say, right, we've got a German patrol near the biggest tree, blah, 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 between the two church steeples. They knew exactly where to point the gun.
So did they destroy it before they left? They didn't, did they? They were still firing when the Germans took it.
They were firing the last ammunition, and they just before they blew it up, so the Germans took it over. But there was virtually no ammunition left for it. But this is a beauty. Now the system is ever so simple. It's completely man-powered, mechanical. There's no electricity, there's no hydraulics. Two gigantic counterweights on balancing arms. The turret is balanced, it's neutral. It goes up in 1.5 seconds. That's 70 tons that moves in 1.5 seconds. And it comes down in 1.5 seconds.
So I have to ask, what year was this made, built?
1905, roughly.
This is the cavalry.
One of the lips. Yeah. You would pull the original gun, the worn gun out manually, and then you would lift that up using chains and block and tackle through this little gap here and get it up into the turret and fix it into place, all by hand.
Yep.
Perhaps it's 3.5, 4.
I mean, imagine everything that was cracked in here. This thing has been shelled 10 ways from Sunday by everybody.
Yeah. And that's the corridor, I think, that the little German sergeant came along. From that's the embrace, that goes down and under the ditch and gets to the embrasures at the far end. I think he came in right there because that would have led him directly to the gun turret.
Yeah.
following the sign of the fire.
Of course, you could also follow the cables. I'd love to see the original cables are still here. This is cracks from shelling. That the planks are now coming down through.
Well, they're airborne spores.
What really is amazing to me is the amount of shells and heavy artillery that landed on the roof of this fort, that these tunnels are still here and intact. A few cracks here and there, granted, some water here and there, but they're still intact. When you look at the outside of this fort, there's no shapes that are even recognizable. The powder magazines are located on the second floor down below the various barracks. And this is interesting because we are looking at a time where black powder was still a thing. And there are very few things in the annals of military history that is more volatile than black powder. Thus, you had a hallway behind the powder magazines with a glass that would have been placed right here and a light that would light up the powder magazines so people could see and work. However, there would be no way of a flame from this light to actually interact and set off the powder. So behind the powder magazines, there are literally small walkways from where this light could be ignited and fueled. And in the best tradition of old naval battleships, to enter the powder magazine, the soldiers would have to remove any kind of clothing or shoes with metal hobnobs that might set off a spark that might ignite the powder.
This is still a beautiful piece of...
When you think they built it in 3 or 4 years. Now you're going to see something extraordinary, which they added end of 16, beginning of 17. Because the entries to the fort were always well known, so you could fire at the entries. So you couldn't get in or out without being fired on. And so the French were fed up with this. And they decided to dig shafts, deep shafts, connected to tunnels hastily dug out, which led behind a hill. So you could rush down a tunnel, climb up a shaft, and go this.
I hear ladders on both sides.
Yeah, there was a lift here, a wooden platform, and an electric motor to make it go up and down. This one to recapture the fort.
Oh yeah, there's a tunnel up there. I mean another level that you can get to right there.
Oh, yeah. Well, the motor was in there, the electric motor. The connecting, the insulators for it. The Germans probably nicked that in 1940. But the wooden platform went up and down. It's shaky, couldn't that far down. It's a hell of a long way down. The tunnel has collapsed underneath. I haven't measured it, but that's a long way.
It is a long way. And was this for ventilation back then as well, or was this an exit as well? This was the original entrance.
The original wartime entrance. Okay.
Well, into a collapsed tunnel now.
Ventilation chances in.
Well, it goes into the room above.
When this place is on fire, you go up there like a rat up a drain pipe. Now, we are going to, schoolroom. We're going to climb up again, and we're going to get to somewhere very sad. All the drains run down the center. That's a good thing. Yeah.
Let me go first and get a shot. I don't want to film your butt walking up the stairs. Don't want. I mean, it's still a nicely built. It's still a beautiful structure.
700 young Germans buried behind the wall.
Really?
Because what happened was that the German doctor was one of the survivors of this gigantic accidental explosion, and he wrote a report which was lost for decades. I found a copy of it, and he was in his first aid post looking after a wounded soldier, and a blast came down the corridor outside his first aid post, throwing men against the wall and crushing them, destroying their lungs. He ran out to find what had happened, and I think he found a witness and said, look, one of our sentries, one of our guys, was by a hole in the wall made by a shell, and he thought he heard French voices, African voices. The troops the Germans were most afraid of were the tirailleurs sénégalais from Senegal. These are big guys. You see them play football. They form a line, they charge, they knock everybody over. The Germans were dead scared of the Senegalese, for good reason. They were the crack French colonial troops. So this sentry thought he heard African voices. He panicked and threw a stick grenade out through the hole, but it rolled back in. He dived for cover, the grenade went off, it set off a stock of petrol that they had for their little burners to make their coffee. That set off a stock of shells. The blast went through the fort, killed hundreds of men. The survivors, with their faces blackened, staggered out into the fresh air, and the German machine gunners on the roof thought they were African troops and started killing their own men, so they ran back inside. When they were trying to bury the dead, the French gunners fired at them. They lost even more men, so they took nearly 700 young men and they walled them up at the end of a tunnel and filled it in with stones, and they're still there today. It's the only German war cemetery allowed on the battlefield of Verdun by a clause in the Treaty of Versailles. They said, we don't want any German cemeteries here. They're all around. There are 80,000 Germans buried all around the battlefield of Verdun, but none on the actual battlefield, only French, because the Germans were the ones who attacked and destroyed everything and caused chaos. But they've never had the heart to move those 700 men there.
Considering the amount of shells that landed on the outside of this thing, on the ground.
Actually, this corridor looks like it was added later. Can you see it?
This looks like this could have been the outside.
Yeah, this is the original.
This is the original powder magazine, isn't it? Or the...
No, we're up on the ground floor.
Yes, oh yes, we are. But this is gorgeous masonry out here.
Yes, it is. You know, the keystones.
Yes.
Decorated.
That's nice with the bed racks, 4 people, four rifle racks. Yes.
And you're pretty much secure in here, let's be honest.
So that's the defensive position.
Yeah. When we were in the Fort Douaumont, you will see why they built this. When the French captured it, they built chicanes in here. You can fire machine guns, you can throw grenades. Because the Germans fought in the tunnels in the Fort Douaumont.
Yep.
For a day and a half.
I thought we couldn't go on those tunnels.
We can go in the parts of them, but not under most of it. It's a double-decker fort, but you can't see most of it underground. There's another monument on the chicane. There's some French soldiers. 30, just this was not that. 30 Germans were in here when the French shell exploded in the middle of them.
That's a monument to the Germans as well.
Yeah.
So if they predicted, there actually are 2 monuments to German soldiers at Verdun.
Yes, yes. But they were dusting the outside because nothing left.
No. And that's why half the room is missing, I'm guessing.
Yes. Yes.
So that's why it caved in and they bricked it up on the inside, because the whole room doesn't exist anymore. I suppose this is another testament to why you need to reinforce your cement walls.
The First World War had now taught one of the final and most important lessons of the evolution of fortresses. Better cement and steel rebar reinforcement was needed, something that all sides would embrace by the time of World War II. But a lesson dearly paid by those occupying the forts that collapsed around them. Also, sanitary and water needs became an important lesson. The capability to withstand sieges for months became important. Thus, the forts were better supplied, had back doors, ground wells, proper bathroom facilities. These were the main lessons. The cannons and steel domes were from before World War I and remained in place, and were reused in newer forts of World War II. This is where the series Great Fort will continue, of course, but here I will spin off with one in Verdun and for World War I. I want to show you the most extraordinary sights of World War I, many I promise you have never seen, and some of the most amazing advances in bunker technology that took place right here. With so many great forts as well as small ones, I want us together to take the journey through World War I and the fortresses here and in Belgium, Liège, Metz.
Built before World War I, part of the fortified line.
Part of the ring of fortifications, or the outer ring.
So this is an ammunition bunker.
Yeah.
That was built before World War I.
Or troop shelter.
Or troop shelter.
It's, yeah, look, it's got a reinforced concrete roof.
But this is not a wet, muddy trench. This is an actual bunker with rebar from World War I.
Yeah, from World War I. Ventilation.
Well, I guess I'm standing on what used to be the roof.
Yes, the whole roof has disappeared. The central part of it.
This is why I left the light in the car.
Yeah, I left my torch in the car as well. I didn't know you were going to go inside.
Well, I can't really get much further than this because the roof seemed to have matched the floor. But I'm just saying, this is the same type of rebar I would see in World War II, with cement slabs hanging down, reinforced.
Reinforced concrete.
There's rebar sticking out of the ground here everywhere.
Yeah, so the concrete went further up than you are.
And you sort of see the outline, I'm imagining.
There is a little ouvrage, the next one along, which is the other side of the ossuary, and there's less of it visible than is of this bunker. It's been blown completely to pieces. The lookout observation armoured cupola is just in pieces. The top of it's lying on the ground. You think, what the hell happened to that? There's still Germans buried in the 75 casemate that collapsed.
How much deeper than this would this have been?
No, that was
it.
About the original depth. Yeah.
When did they start putting cement slabs in? Did they build this before the fighting broke out?
Yeah, they built it before.
This is a French trench.
Yeah, French communications trenches.
Okay, so they built these trenches to surround the fort before the war started, when they had time and.
System they built before 1914.
Yeah, it's good. With time and resources, you can do things like this, but is that rebar inside the walls from the...
Although the French prioritized the 75 quick-firing cannon for open warfare, a battery of 4 guns could lay down 80 shells a minute of shrapnel at any advancing enemy columns, who wouldn't stay long in the open. They would dig holes or they would run away. But once trench warfare came along, the French found out that they'd prioritized the wrong cannon. A French 75 fires horizontally. The German in the trench ducks his head, the shell flies over the top. They had to add blanking plates to the front of the shells to destroy their trajectory, to try to make them drop into a German trench. That's a waste of time. You need howitzers and big mortars. Yeah. The Germans had thousands produced by Krupp. The French had hundreds at the beginning. But the Creusot factories and Schneider were producing thousands of these gigantic howitzers for foreign countries because the French army weren't buying them. So when they came on board, the French army seized the orders, the export orders, and threw them into the front lines, and then got Schneider and Creusot to make their big babies, like the rail guns. I mean, they were building an answer to the Paris gun.
It is interesting of World War I that so many key figures of World War II fought here and were wounded here. World War I, General Patton was there and he was wounded. Montgomery was there and wounded. De Gaulle was there, wounded and captured. Maginot, Halder, Model, Göring, and Hitler, of course. All of them understood now the value of armor protection. They understood casualties on the battlefields and that of fortifications.
I hope you enjoy history and military history as much as I love bringing it to you. And if you want to see more of the photos and documents I've used for these episodes, documentation, so on, you can go to lostbattlefields.com. And if you feel like helping me out traveling around the world to some of these far-flung locations like Van Allen Brown's first test stand behind me, or Deepness nuclear reactor down there, or the Maginot Line over there, you can donate on PayPal, protection@serviceint.com. It'll be right here, and it is also on lostbattlefields.com. You absolutely don't have to, but I appreciate any help, and I love all you guys for all the support you've shown me, because history is important. We all know that, and I'm going to bring it to you.